You mentioned okay, so I mentioned I was underweight briefly. Um, there was a time, and this is why I use oaths all the time, or I use competitive games in general all the time. Um, you mentioned burnout before, Alex, and I use a non-physical means of like burnout is incredibly self-inflicted when it comes to like yes, there's a physical component to it, but generally it's motivated by a intellectual component. And using competitive games is a great platform. For me, I was underweight and I could claim that I was working on it, but it held very little priority compared to what I was doing at the time. When I was young, I was underweight because I was burning out like mad. It didn't feel like burnout, but I was like Icarus heading straight for the sun. So whether I ate or sleep was quite optional to what I was doing at the time. So intellectually, I hit college, and then when I hit college, everything became a sort. I kind of hinted at this before, where like yesterday you asked about when did I discover that learning is what keeps me going, what keeps me motivated. Well, it wasn't until I realized I was burning out that I truly appreciated what keeps me motivated. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't realize that I need to focus on my physical health and be able to moderate that whole learning aspect. When I hit college and then went to graduate school, I became incredibly malnourished because no longer when you hit graduate school, you're really mandatorily or structurally engaged in needing to eat, socialize, and when you get to graduate school, you make all those decisions as an adult. In college and even earlier, like high school and middle school, you have your parents, you have the social structure of the schedule, right? Yeah. And this is why I talk about the internet quite a lot, the internet generation, where if you have a choice and you didn't develop the skills to moderate and balance your life, when you head into adulthood where you are given all the choices, right? You can make all the choices. Inherently, I chose a lifestyle that I could not sustain. So I worked really hard. I was in love with my job. Like I absolutely love my job. I go to the lab. I prefer to be in the lab as long as I can. And things just spiraled incredibly out of control. I stopped my social links, right? Fell by the wayside, and then my weight became incredibly dangerously low. It took a jolt 3 years into my graduate school, and that's when the Tough Mudder happened. So that created some early balance for fitness. So then I ate more. I actually force fed myself to get into a shape that allowed me to train for Tough Mudder. So like I was eating like pints of ice cream. Like if I get to the grocery store, like I had a lot of resources because I didn't use any of that resources. I was more or less married to my job, and that means I had a lot of money and other things that I don't use when most people would use them. So a lot of times when you think about someone who says like, "Oh yeah, I'm kind of strapped for cash. There's so many things I want to buy and stuff." There's some merit to that. There's very important understanding. I was someone who had a lot of resources, but I didn't use those resources. I kept focusing on my job and keep on like doing the science stuff, right? Constantly learning and then teaching other people, learning, teaching, and the cycle kept continuing. But I stopped taking care of myself. So even the most successful people, quote unquote, most successful people in particular skill sets and parameters, it would they have to give up balance to really achieve that. So it's a really knack to find where you can balance those things. So when I was underweight, I conceptually understand that I need to work on it. It doesn't create, no matter how intelligent you are or self-aware you are, when you're in an emotionally clouded state, you might not even know you're in an emotionally clouded state. And if you're given a choice and you haven't had the experience to make that balance, you can't possibly achieve that balance. So that's one of the things, right? In high school, one of the things that kept me sane, ironically, is that the learning process was slow. It was too slow. So what happens? That enables me boredom. And that boredom was actually something that kept me at bay from burning out. Although I did then get video games. My parents gave me video games, which helped a lot with my learning desires. So it's always a constant balance. It's understanding how to rest is my mantra most of the time, because I know how it feels and what would happen personally when you feel restless. And nowadays, the internet hustle culture, when you're given the choice to always actively engage yourself with the things you want without developing any learning experience to moderate that and regulate that, like learning when to chill, knowing that if you need to rest, it only makes you consolidate and become strong. Like, not seeing those things early on in life and you're always getting choice, inherently you're going to breed a whole generation of burnout individuals. And burnout happens already, like, it's not a new thing. Burnout happens, and it's a learning lesson and a balance lesson for almost everyone who has already made it. So if you interview a very successful person, the first strategies and life lessons, they will probably like contextually sound unique, but the core of it is to find the work balance, like the balance that makes it sustainable. And their first roadblock, like the hardest things they would probably say, is when they were going over their heads, like they were taking on too much. And the real success story here is generally the life lesson about not going too ham. But you don't hear about most of that. Generally on YouTube, you get to decide what you watch. So if early on as a kid, kids are very passionate, they are very impressionable, and they will latch on to the very first things that they're very used, like they love. Those things will not provide sustainability. It's highly statistically unlikely for someone who was born into this world that do not inherit transferable skills and experience from their parents or any their predecessors, like obligatorily, like you're not going to inherit those experiences if you choose not to. So most of the kids who, in my opinion, predominantly grow up on the internet, I believe the adults and the people who make content are indirectly, they're not legally responsible to consider these things yet. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But they are at least morally and ethically responsible for understanding that those kids that they influence indirectly could be their kids, who then choose to only follow certain things and do not develop the necessary life skills to be healthy with anything. Video games is now the current uptrending lifestyle among any, in my opinion, at risk. Youth are typically at risk now because gaming is a lifestyle choice. And gaming hasn't moved to a point where it is ethically or morally responsible to develop proper life hygiene. And I say this because before video games and the internet, professionals or people like me have already encountered this. It's with other things. So I love learning. When do you learn? When do you start doing that? When you're young. So obviously, inherently, I formed an addiction to learning. Like I had a problem with constantly needing to learn. It ate away at my well-being. That's like being addicted to something you love. Video games can serve the same purpose, like the same substitute. If you fall in love with a video game, you form an addiction to it. And it's not an addiction that I feel a lot of the earlier studies are talking about, where they're like, oh yeah, it can make you like violent and all that stuff. Not necessarily. If it becomes a coping mechanism, like a sustainable coping mechanism, then you have an addiction. Wanting to play video games and being dependent on video games are very two are it might not it might sound similar, but it's very different. Like, I was dependent on my job. It gave me value. It provided that dopamine that I wanted, regardless of how I feel physically. Like, I was clearly mentally exhausted, and I could definitely see that my work quality is declining, but it's not declining rapidly enough to know that if I keep doing more, I keep getting better. What does that sound like? It sounds like a lot of OS players that have a very, very terrible, vicious feedback loop with their life. So, and I'm familiar with that because I'm actually acquainted with one or two people now through this experience that I'm sharing these things, and I like to think that I can be able to see that they're becoming healthier. Like, you can be a great OS player and still go outside and touch grass, is kind of what I'm saying. I was underweight and I clearly know I needed to work on it, but the solution was not me. I I would say most of my life learning lessons that caused these triggers and changes was dependent on other people. The problem with the internet is you don't get that chance. So if the internet is curating and telling you what you want, like when you look for something, it'll give you more of what you want to see. You can never get news. You will statistically be unlikely to get new stimuli that inspires you to jolt you out of things. So when I was young, I had to be in those situations. I had to go to school. College was accepted as a norm. I had to get a job early. I have to leave my nest. Those are like social pressures. And because of those things, I can earnestly tell people that I was lucky in life. I was lucky enough to be identified as a gifted student through like transferring from a poor school to a affluent school. I went to college and met serendipitously one of the people that shaped my life. He was my professor, advisor, and academic advisor. I don't know if he is ever going to hear this, and he still works at the same college, who I can drive like an hour and a half to go to thank him again. And graduate school, like all those things happen because I can't control the environment that I'm in. If you spend most of your life having all the choices in the world, you're going to choose the thing that your human condition dictates, which is the thing that gives you dopamine, like all the time. So what does that happen? It's not that big of a difference from morphine addiction, alcohol abuse. I still would prefer it because there are so many detrimental things about, drug abuse and in general, right? So naturally, if people are talking about like, oh yeah, why this is gonna come back for the next 2 months, because there was a person who commented and it kind of made that video really big, is that oh, OS, like you're playing OS. How's that with problem solving? It's like, well, I choose something that is readily available and less harmful to talk about. Obviously, I could choose alcohol abuse or um, you know, recreational drug use. That could be a very serious topic. But the thing is, those things are even less sustainable. So before it gets to that, right, I choose video games. And OS is one of them. I actually feel compelled to note that when you look at the average OS stream and look at their chat, I do see thriving youngsters who have a particular behavior set, but I also see, in my opinion, not trying to predict the future that much, but I do see that the vast majority of them will develop a problem in problem solving, critical thinking when they get into adulthood, right? Like when they become their mid 20s or early 30s, something like that. So that's why I talk about OS quite a bit. Actually, that's why I talk about competitive games in general. And I truly believe with this communication that the people who make video games also have the power to do so. Like, I would be floored when there's going to be a live service game that literally tells you, hey, guys, here's the roadmap. We're going to give you content that you can come back to play for a week on and off. And then there's going to be 3 weeks. Go outside and do something else. Come back next week and you'll have another week worth of content. That's not inferred anywhere. Like, it's not implied anywhere. It's not seen as an opportunity to do that. What do most hustle culture generation look at now? It's like, dude, like, what the heck, man? Like, don't you want your game to be successful? Isn't that what PSO does do that? Yes, it does do that. And I think it's beginning to look like that quite a bit now. It's beginning to look like that. Like, if you miss something, right now, games, even live serving games, if you miss something, you can still get a chance to get it in the next cycle. So the thing is to alleviate FOMO, but I'm not entirely sure if it's intentionally, like intellectually intentional. I feel like it's pragmatically intentional now. So for example, now with all this live service stuff, it's become clear that lucratively or pragmatically is not sustainable. Player retention is fairly low and it goes through cycles. So naturally, if you focus on the objectivity and the pragmatism of making more money or retaining players, it naturally led to a design that reduced FOMO, increased loyalty, and then those loyalty people are the result of healthier hygiene with their lifestyle choice, which is gaming now. And those people naturally come back in an expected pattern, right? You play the game, like say you go work out for 2 weeks. Well, you should rest. You can have a deload week. Your body isn't going to like just randomly revert to its previous state if you're practicing like lifestyle hygiene. So that's kind of the idea. Very successful people are different in a really great way, or a very discernible way. You can notice a person who's going to burn out like a wildfire, and you can notice a successful person who's burning out like a wildfire in the future, like in the near future, and you can see a successful person that regardless of what they do or how frequently and high intensity they do, they'll make it successful. So there's a difference between someone who goes around turning everything into gold versus someone who keeps gold digging. And they both can be very successful in a cross-sectional way. Like in the moment, it might not seem different, but to someone like me who feel like the sky was the limit, only to have the rug pulled from under me because of my own like physical needs, right? It's a lot more obvious to me when I see someone who clearly is in the road of a burning, like ready to hit a wall eventually. And all of these talks and discussions is not intentionally trying to gaslight people, but just to get them to realize it themselves. Like I ask questions about how you feel, and whenever someone says, oh, this isn't interesting, like my life isn't interesting. Well, you've been working out for 6 months. I don't know how much to tell you, Alex, but working out consistently 6 months and developing an unconditional need to work out, you are already statistically above average. Like I would say if you take the global, the privilege section, like if someone was given a choice to exercise and you take all of those, like this is just thought experiment. It's not something that I have actual data for. but if you think about the logic, if the human condition often weighs someone for gluttonous, right? Gluttonous or dopamine inspired action. If you live in a environment that you have the luxury and the privilege to choose to work out or do something else, right? Like, we're not talking about places where you don't have the privilege to do that or the time to do that. So if you ask a human being to do that, they would naturally not choose to work out. That's the average right now. So you starting your fitness journey and suddenly becoming 6 months in and developing an unconditional habit of it, that's incredible. Sharing that with anyone else, which you did, which is even more incredible. You're like even above average when you were able to encourage others to do the same. Charisma and leadership does not come naturally a lot of times in this day and age, especially people in your age group. It's far more common to do something for yourself. And yes, certainly you were self-motivated at first, but you already shared that you invited other people. That makes you well into the higher percentiles. Most people do things for themselves only. Like yesterday's conversation about Costco versus contemporary, that is a person that is only concerned about themselves. They believe they can shape the world without the need to consider other people. And that's usually a reflection of, in my opinion, the dominant feeling when you're always the main character on YouTube and you're always the main character on Twitch because you have all the choices. Even your video games, if you take the natural landscape of what are the most popular archetypes in video games, is a role-playing game in which you are the main character. What kind of role-playing games do I like? When I'm not the main character. I'm playing someone who is a main character, who isn't me. So I don't get to choose what their lifestyle is. I get to see what their lifestyle is. I am a participant in that person's life. So I get to learn about someone else's life that I can use for my own benefit or my own disadvantage. So I am a collector of stories. I am not one who needs to shape everything around me. That's a little different story because I thought I was doing well. And just to wrap it up and go back to the underweight question, I thought I was doing really well for myself. The world seemed like it was pandering to me, right? Everything came easy, sort of, and and then I had problems too, and those problems were all about me. So how do things help with my problems? Like, you're not interesting, this is not interesting, it doesn't get me what I want, right? That's natural. It's not bad or good. When you're young, you have to, as quickly as possible, desirably, right, to create self-sustainability and an identity. Well, I had that when I was like 6. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that most people can't resonate with me because I'm pretty classically a high functioning kid that obviously had some imbalance issues. And one of them is forming an incredibly strong identity incredibly early in life. So like I was immalleable. Like I did not have I didn't take on what friends wanted to do. I didn't join, so I had a really strong self-identity early on, and that prevented me from learning. Ironically, learning the things I don't want to learn. So I was great at learning things, or like I enjoy learning things, but like most kids, I enjoyed the things that I think are important to me. And when I got older into adulthood, I realized that I lack a ton of skills that all the other kids around me probably have and they traded off some of that for what I have. So in the end of the day, you could be a very successful person on paper, but man, if you're not a healthy person, you're not going to last very long. And that's kind of the take home message. Um why, this person thought that oath is very trivial to them. It's like, that's fine. If they believe that it's true, I would actually agree with them. It's the very reason why I choose gaming as a platform to talk about these things. Because you want to be practicing, in my opinion, you want to be making learning lessons out of things you do every day, safely, harmlessly, for the days when you are making the big decisions. So it's about being ready. It's about preventive. It's creating a lifestyle that makes you ready and adaptive for anything is to come. Like, uh, because of a lot of these things, when grief, accidents happen, when someone suffers an injury or someone's spiraling, I'm ready for it. Like, I'm that guy that is calm and collected most of the time. Now, when I was underweight, right? I didn't know I was underweight. I had no idea why when the day is ending, I don't want to go back home, like to my apartment, right? My apartment was barren. It had nothing in it. In fact, it had one air mattress, a desk for my desktop, and some kitchenware. At one point, it didn't even have a light in the house. And all my objects, like my books and stuff, they were just stacked in the corner on top of each other. I had this huge space, or not really huge. It's probably small for most people. It's no bigger than a standard size room. Like if you're into like Japanese culture, like that those dorm rooms, it was probably bigger than a dorm room in general at most universities around the world. And I used like 10% of the space. I think the most space I ever used was the bathroom because the toilet and the shower had to take up a fixed amount of space. And I didn't even use the kitchen. It was just literally the footprint of a microwave and the refrigerator that was actually being used. So I can do all these things like, I don't know, uh, talk about genetics, virology, instruct a lot of kids, but when I come home, I'm just at this below average person who can't even take care of themselves. That's the real cold reality of what happens. And you just substitute that for video games. Like if it wasn't science, it could be video games. The nice thing about video games is you might not inherently be making a decision that could possibly disrupt a lot of things. Like, for example, as a scientist, you could literally be desperate enough to publish misinformation, and that misinformation could impact hundreds of thousands of people, or at least immediately your entire department, your colleague, right? So video games at least have a self-contained component where it's still pretty bad though, in my opinion, because competitive games is an interpersonal skill. So when you have any form of ranking system, it naturally connects two people together or a lot of people together. And what happens is it normalizes behavior that trivializes other people. Other people become stats. So like when you go and talk and approach someone and say, you're a 6 digit, I'm a 5 digit, and that becomes the relationship, right? Because your whole universe of defining people has become dictated by a metric system, and that does normalize all your decision making. So how do you buy a product? Well, what metrics are there? I still buy products on a whim. I like buying creative products for that reason. Thankfully, there are still people who make creative products that are hard to measure, because one way to kind of balance yourself out from this incredible need to be objective is to do something creative. The creative side of things allows one to be okay or normalize the idea that you can't measure, you don't necessarily can't measure everything. You don't necessarily want to measure everything. It's removing the human component away from your lifestyle. So when you start thinking about fitness as a bunch of weight progressions, fitness as a bunch of how much time you do something, how frequently and consistently you do it, you lost the human element. You no longer sit there and ask yourself, how do you feel today? What did you look around the gym when you were working out? How can you use this to establish an emotional interpersonal connection with someone else, which you do, by the way, Alex. It's glorious. I think the most important, the most exciting thing is kudos to you on working out, but the most impressive thing to me that makes me really, really like hopeful about your life is that you involved other people. You encourage your friends and then you encourage other people. That is a skill that is rarely happening online anymore. You might be thinking, well, people go into chat rooms and they are online and stuff. They're names. They're like abstractions. When you look at their conversations, the vast majority of the conversations are not involved or forced to be personable. Like it's, hey guys, like I just thought I'd show this video. It's fantastic. Post. That's it. Just that's the end of it. It doesn't even know, people don't even practice describing how that video made them feel. Like, what are your thoughts, guys? It's like, oh cool, I saw it too. Ah, that's it. It's there's a lot of opportunity there, just not a lot of practice. And for better or for worse, some people can coexist very happily, right? It's still early. It's still in the early days to know what happens when this continues. And pragmatically speaking, other people are encouraged to design ways to retain their services. And that retention of their services is leading to better forms of expression. So a great example would be the emoji, right? The emote explosion. Emote is at least bridging, it's naturally creating higher retention and engagement, right? Engagement. But engagement is not with the intent of personal mental hygiene. It's pragmatic. So early days, when we needed language, humans are pressured to be pragmatic, and it led to better education and language. And you are seeing that in an internet renaissance. The internet, while I'm not spelling doom and gloom, because generally speaking, something push comes to shove, eventually pragmatism, with enough pragmatism, it is encouraged to develop those tools, whether it's intended or not. So now, if you go back 10 years and look at how the internet interacted with each other, it was way more it was different. It was a hyper use of words, right? Hyper use of words, because identities and categorization was in its infancy. Now, 10 years now, categorization is incredibly fluent and exact. Yesterday's discussion about being classified as a classical guitarist versus contemporary guitarist, that's a symptom of the internet, for better or for worse. Now that this is in place, pragmatism is going to take over and refine that. Now we're in a generative AI phase, where maybe when someone types in classical guitarist on Google, you don't just get a defined, response anymore. You get a dynamic response. So eventually it will adjust. I'm not trying to predict the future, as I often say. I'm observing the present to develop skills that may be useful in the future. So there are lots of skills that you can have as a human being that is ever practical for the future. It's not context specific. And oftentimes when I'm talking to younger people, everything requires context-specific purposes. When you problem solve, it's context independent. So when I'm trying to talk and introduce different perspectives, and the first thing that person says is "it depends," that's not the point. I'm not talking about the contextual dependency. I'm talking about the act of thinking about it. Like the act of thinking about classical guitarists and contemporary guitarists being interpreted differently. It's the exercise of doing that. And then, a few days back, it's not about OS being problem solving by design. It's using OS as a problem solving exercise. So that person, everything that person said was accurate. I'm intentionally trying hard to make OS an exercise in critical thinking and problem solving. Whether there's a meaning to it or not is not the purpose. To this person, there's no meaning to problem solving in OS. That is a person who believes in a concrete contextual status. So their learning process and their adaptability is static forever, because that's all that is. There is only that. I do not care if something is insignificant to something. It's using insignificant things and practicing making them significant. I can't emphasize how much someone's life, in my opinion, personally, taken from someone who basically turned the thing they love to the thing that was causing them to suffer, right? That sounds like pretty much every top OS player eventually. I don't know how you feel about that, but that does happen. It's called burnout as well. When you are able to practice the skill of creating significance with anything, nothing can stop you. Like, in my opinion, nothing can stop you. It's one of the life skills. It's one of like 3 or 4 life skills. But the one life skill that's not interpersonally dependent, like you give you more independence, is the idea that anything you do, and when it becomes a habit, it still becomes inherently interesting to you. How you do that is context dependent. But having the skill to do that, it can be applied to anything. So you can make it context dependent at first. So for example, your gym, your fitness, right? The first month, this is kind of one of the, we're going into this digression now. I'll just keep moving my hands as much as I can. One of the fitness is a great example. So you go in, what does a personal trainer see very often? Well, this person got a big jolt, got a slap somewhere, like, oh, dude, your doctor just said, like, man, you're going to have a heart attack any day. So they get slapped, right, with the problem. Just slapped in the face with a problem. Then enters the personal trainer. You see this person incredibly enthusiastic, ambivalent, and scared. So all of that motivates the person for the first month. Then when you enter past the honeymoon period of that slap, that emotional stressor that was early on begins to be more and more distant. So what happens is a personal trainer, I'm not saying this is what personal trainers actually do. I personally train some people, and this is what I do. I try to use that first month of honeymoon period to allow them, to give them like tools and thinking in order for them to, once they exit out of the honeymoon period, become attached to fitness. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, you change that fear into gains. Give them the process of understanding what it looks like that's desirable. Like, hey, so, they could say they're losing weight. It's like, well, there are other things than losing weight. There are other things than losing weight that you can gain. Remember, there are lots of things you can focus on that'll keep you motivated. And if you can keep looking if you enable a person to always find something that keeps them motivated, that's context independent. It doesn't depend on anything. Like, they will find it. You are enabling them to find the thing. So you as an instructor don't need to provide some super big brain, like, semantic knowledge of all the possibilities. You enable the person to do it. You give them the tools, the skills to do it for themselves for the rest of their lives. And that is different than playing a video game for a purpose. It's different than playing something that has a rating system. The rating system only tells you what is important. You didn't spend time figuring out what is important. So those are the early days. As a kid, it's usually sustainable because the kid eventually encounters something that allows them to find out what's important to them. School establishes foundations, and those foundations are supposed to enable a kid, challenge a kid enough to create the life skills to find out what's important to them. What's important to you is not necessarily the rating system. If it's coincidentally the rating system, then this kid's gonna be a superstar and it'll be sustainable and stuff. I call that luck. That is a coincidental, serendipitous luck. Yesterday's topic, when we were talking about classical guitarists and contemporary guitarists, someone who claims they are a contemporary artist and want to make music for themselves and hope that it resonates with other people, that is luck. That is coincidence. You can believe you are contemporary, but it's dependent on if you become contemporary with other people. It's different than a person who says they're contemporary artists and they're concerned with what is contemporary. So they make contemporary things because it already resonates with people. And then using that as a learning experience to become unique. Those are two different processes. The latter one is more reliable. The former is a chance. It's a high risk, high reward approach. Your life skills are more latter than former. However, most of the internet encourages people to learn life skills with the former than the latter. So cue in life hack number 100 or something. Hey, if you do this and this, it'll work out. No process of learning, nothing. It's just contextual. Like, it's this particular situation, this particular condition, this particular person. So you're getting advice from someone who have already pre-selected all your conditions. If you're lucky, just like the former thing, this person is exactly like you or so similar to you. This is what the internet relies on. That the algorithm has put you in connection with someone so similar to you by chance, because you have to take it from the perspective of the kid. The kid only knows so much about themselves so far. So the algorithm is going to select and match up the content to how much the kid understands about themselves and hope that with enough checkpoints, right, enough converging evidence, that influencer is similar enough to this kid that when they say things and when they do things, it will match up with the kid's future. There's a really, really big if here. It's assuming that the social conditions of when that influencer was the age of that viewer is going to be the same for the viewer who's being influenced when they become that age. And the one big thing that doesn't stay static is your environment. Social dynamics do not stay the same in human societies. They can try very, very hard to stay the same. But humans do that thing where you get bored of the same thing eventually. Most people in their lives go through this routine all the time. It's like, dude, I don't want to run today. It's like, I've done this for a year. Like, let's switch it up. It's going to dynamically change over time. It's a basic, in my opinion, it's a basic human condition. It exists. And being able to design something around that is great. And yeah, I'm not surprised, Alex, that you do that with your friends. The approach to getting people to do things and enabling them and encouraging them to see other sources of significance. I'm not saying I'm not using the word positive or negative, because negative things can be significant. So is positive things. It just has to be relatively significant to that person. Developing significance is untapped fuel. It's only as high as your intellectual capabilities are able to do it. Let me tell you, just to ground this, there is too much of it too, right? We're talking about balance. So if everything becomes significant, much like this person said, his counter argument is that if there isn't significance and you find significance in it, it can warp your reality. That's very apt at an extreme case. And I'm not addressing those type of things. I don't naturally encounter people who find everything incredibly enthusiastic. If so, then let's just look at the data here, right? I would be an incredibly high content creator who's incredibly popular if everyone can find significance in everything. Like, so I'm not pandering to a population that exists. So when that person was talking about, like, they have a reasonable comment, like, you're looking for meaning where there isn't to them. It's like, absolutely. What is the reality, though? Most people don't think like him. Or most people are not encouraged or trying to think like him, right? And most people are not encouraged to try to think like me. There's somewhere in between, but usually the platform that I have is more likely that the person finds things insignificant than significant. If you go to college, if you go to university, and you talk about, hang around with people who are looking to have PhDs, it might actually seem incredibly exhausting, almost non-sustainable, because most things are significant, even the little things. What do those people deal with? They deal with things that I described. I had a poor work-life management, like balance. So there is a caveat to that. It's moderation. However, if you're already deficient at finding meaning in things, then you start with finding meaning in things. That person clearly went out of their way to show that whatever I'm doing is insignificant because they believe it's insignificant, right? Well, I'm not heard about that. I just met someone who thinks that it is their right and their entitlement to make things insignificant if they think it's insignificant. I'm not concerned about my pride here. I'm more concerned about that person's health. That person's health, they trivialize things. I wonder what else they trivialize about their own lives, right? Like to quote it, they summarize the OS community as a bunch of weebs that have the average age range of 10-year-olds, like a 10-year-old average age. Well, obviously that's not factually correct in any metric ever, so the reality doesn't agree with this person, but that forms a basis of their entire decision making and what they went out to do. There's more to it. There's a lot more to it. So, I think after I started asking questions, the gameplay to talking ratio is around 1 hour, 1 to 25. Well, this is the gameplay, right? Generally, let me be a little bit more exact about this. So when I talk, there's a period. I'm gonna say one topic, 3 subtopics. So when I start talking about something, and if my mind starts thinking about more than 3 or 4 subtopics, and I've entered 3 or 4 more subtopics, I tell myself that I am going to now commit to it, and then I'm gonna spin it to at least 10 or so subtopics, and then go back to the original topic, and then round it off for a hour piece. So I have this internal timer that's going on about how many topics that I need to talk about or cover in order to create a coherent piece enough, right? Enough coherent piece so then I can make a video out of it. That's what my if you're looking at my collection of deep digression videos, um it's very rare, super rare that they are ever less than an hour. They are generally between 1 hour and 4 hours. And the structure is very similar too. So um, I do actively uh, negotiate these things while I'm talking. I'm doing all of this while I'm talking to you and, expanding upon the topics. And at the moment, I'm keeping track of four or five of the core topics that I have while explaining this part. It's something I do all the time to keep myself engaged. Like, this is a slight digression, slightly unrelated to this, is that when you sit down and you talk to someone, and then suddenly that person's like, oh, hey, are you paying attention? Like, you kind of have this glossy out of space look. Like, can I get your attention, please? Can you actively listen? And oftentimes I want to be candid about it, but generally speaking, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with someone one on one where my attention isn't divided. And it's not because, relatively speaking, it would be considered undivided. However, to explain how my mind works is like explaining trying to understand someone who has an attention deficit, right? A lot of times, ADHD is often depicted as someone who's scatterbrained, who's like they constantly bounce from one fixation to the next fixation. So when you're talking to someone would say like booger, and then go about saying everything else, and suddenly that person who has ADHD will hang onto the booger thing, and then it will spiral into other thoughts while the conversation continues to go, and eventually someone will jolt them back with the stimuli like, hey, are you listening? And then it'll fixation. So now to use that as a basis, I'm sort of doing that too, only all the ideas that I'm practicing is trying to keep myself on task. So it's not that sometimes people lose my divided attention. It's that I spent lots of my years cultivating the patterns of conversation and where they're going to go in order for me to not lose track of them, because my mind will naturally wander. I do think that I have some sort of attention deficit. I wouldn't say that I know professionally if I have an attention deficit, but the idea is instead of letting my mind wander and fixate on certain things, I use that fixation to create a bunch of related ideas in order to keep myself on task. Nowadays, I spend most of my time listening to how people talk, like how they form ideas, where they're going with the ideas. So in case I lose my attention, right, which will naturally happen because I will think about other topics, I will at least have an idea and a good guess where the conversation is going. So a lot of times, people would say something, and I spend so much time practicing this, I kind of have an idea where this conversation is going. And inherently, that becomes a double-edged sword. Now I'm more likely to think of other topics while that person continues to develop their ideas. And ultimately, when that idea comes up, I will already have several ideas prepared for where the conversation can go. So my routine here is that as I'm talking to you and creating this like explainer for how what's going on in my head while I'm explaining stuff, I'm already doing the exact thing. It's an inception moment. So I'm doing a fourth wall, like kind of like I'm doing the very thing I'm describing right now. And I'm thinking of 3 or 4 other topics while I'm explaining the current topic that I'm talking about. So, um, the topic that I want to choose to go into now is the idea that this leads into another segue that I typically use, is the idea of being able to be adaptive in conversation as much as you can. And it alleviates also the thing that makes a lot of people anxious in this day and age. And it is connected with the algorithm. Let me explain this a little bit. So, when you are spending most of your life in an algorithmic driven state, what that does is it reinforces and makes you really good at those things. So, like, if you like rabbits and YouTube is feeding you lots and lots of rabbit videos, at some point you will form the natural intuition to describe and know a lot about rabbits. But the downside of that is you know a lot about rabbits, right? It's a double edge. When you know a lot about something, you know very little about a lot of other things. So the idea is, in order to remove, what happens is it is associated with the depreciation in communication in in this generation, in the internet generation, because now the internet generation has a lot of selective knowledge. So if they are joined by their selective knowledge, the conversation can go on forever. Like if an OS player randomly pops into an OS stream and the OS streamer is a selective part of this generation, they would naturally have a long conversation about OSU, right? And the moment it deviates from OSU, or the moment the semantics and the contextual dependency of the topic is exhausted, they stop talking. They become strangers again. Actually, I would argue focusing on semantics and the specialty of things keep people as strangers. They don't have expression when you're talking about technicalities. So if you expand that to pretty much anything you're interested in YouTube, it's not that surprising, at least to myself, that most people have a development of anxiety. Their first concern with interpersonal communication is the anxiousness of, what if I have nothing to talk about? Well, let's think about the perspective of someone who has specialized knowledge. There are a lot of things they don't know how to talk about. Now, if you put yourself in my shoes, I can say something about pretty much anything. Not that I can say something about everything really well, but I have no reservations or social anxiety because I have something to say in which someone else can contribute to the conversation. Like if I don't know anything about OSU, I can ask about things about OSU. How do you ask about things about OSU? Well, you've answered those questions before and collected those data on a related topic, like a different game. So if I can't tell you about OSU, I can tell you about another rhythm game and hope that you would be able to tell me about OSU with the framework of another rhythm game. So all of that stuff removes social anxiety. It gives you control of a conversation. The greatest barrier right now to even getting your foot through the door, right? This is one of those vicious cycle, like in order to communicate well, you actually have to communicate. So how do you start communicating first? One of the biggest barriers is specialized pre-selected knowledge. If you're watching YouTube based on everything you're interested in, You have to hope in reality that the thing you are watching is contemporary. And that's where YouTube succeeds, or Twitch succeeds, because you know what is popular. You know what is contemporary. So when you like those things, those people are very happy. When they trend away from those things, that context specific experience is no longer useful. So when someone asks me, oh, how much do you know about something? It's like, well, I don't really know a lot about anything, really. It's dynamic, it's ever changing. Like, what is your favorite thing of all time? Well, it's whatever I'm doing now. Because regardless of what I do, I can use my skills to make them significant. It's context independent. So are you a special? This goes into the last topic that was in my head, which is the contrast between specialization and generalization. A specialist will have concerns about not knowing enough, not not being correct, not being accurate, or not being good enough, because a specialist's relative metric is that whatever they're specialized in is the meter that they compare how comfortable they are in talking about it. So if you're a specialist and the only thing you've spent most of your life doing is that one specialty, everything is going to feel like incompetence compared to that. So whenever you're talking, 99%, it's going to feel, it's not literal, but feel like 99% of the time you're out of your element. It's only until you actually engage in feeling like you can talk about something that you're not necessarily well versed in that allows you to alleviate that feeling. So naturally, when I talk to young people, how do I, personal anecdotes, what reinforces this idea? In order to engage with most young people now, I first ask them what interests them. What do they do every day without thinking that they're significant? And then I use that as the jumping point to make everything else relevant to them. And eventually, I like to believe with enough talking of how to do that, like demonstrate how to do that, they naturally do it themselves. And that's all that's needed. And then my final reward, at least for me, the final payout is one day, maybe 2 or 3 years down the line, they come back and they tell me what's significant about their lives, not how they trivialize everything that's happening in their lives, because they're able to communicate outside of themselves. It's one of the greatest landmarks and hallmarks of a teacher or an instructor or an influencer, a leader. They are able to communicate the significance of all the things that make them themselves. It can't happen very well if you're always inwardly focusing, being pre-selected for all the things that you want to see, because those things, done with enough consistency, will become less and less significant. And you're focusing on a higher and higher bar. As you sit at the top of your specialty, it makes pretty much anything else insignificant. It would take the luck of finding something that coincidentally match in significance to make you want to do it. If you're playing video games all the time, you are less likely to do fitness, because fitness becomes less and less significant when it's compared to video games. The longer you do something once, the new thing is going to be harder to learn. It's going to be harder to be approached. You play a lot of video games, sleeping is going to be more difficult, because sleeping doesn't take a priority. My science career was incredibly important to me. I wanted to be the best in what I did. I wanted to teach thousands of people to be critical thinkers and problem solving, and that became my own problem. So now I spend the time using the thing I wanted to do, which is learning critical thinking and problem solving stuff, and I'm using it intentionally to focus on life skill developments. That compensates for my lack of inexperience that I don't particularly want anyone to go through, right? The idea is not really to prevent it from ever happening. It's the idea that when it happens, those people can adjust to it. It's kind of like this isn't an exact one-to-one, but the whole Chinese proverb about give a fish, right? Give a fish to a man, they'll eat for a day. Teach the man to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. It's not exactly the right thing. It's more like if I were to kind of jerry rig the proverb into something a little bit more applicable, it's more like give food to a starving person, or teach the person to feed themselves or find the ability to feed themselves when they are starving. It's not if it's not only when they are starving is or like they are starving at the moment, but when they starve, they can fix the problem. They have enough tools to get food, right? To acquire food. It's both in the present and in the future. As opposed which the proverb does cover, right? If you teach a person to fish, they can eat for a lifetime. That's implying that they are able to fish whenever they're hungry. And that's a proverb that sometimes, if taken literal, it might not include what I'm saying. So, because when you're thinking about food, it's a necessity, it's a life skill. The thing I'm talking about also extends to video games. Video games is not like food at first. It will feel like food the more you focus on it. It will feel like it's unconditional. So here's the thing, right, Alex? What's a great way to relate back to what you shared? Now you have to work out no excuses, right? There's a upper limit to that as well. When you do something with no excuses, it becomes less and less intellectually significant. So you're to keep that at bay, right? To make it feel like it's not a going through the routine and you're just grinding away. You have to find other significance. And luck and coincidentally or intentionally maybe, getting more friends to join you and having them create that noise is what can offer limitless possibilities. So that whole sentimentalism that I was talking about, or the emotional impact, is when you introduce a variable space into something that's routine, it becomes ever refreshing. It doesn't have to be incredible significance. When you're alone and you're doing a routine, you also need tools to keep it ever refreshing. However, you can always trust another human being to keep it ever refreshing. So ultimately, when someone is at a loss and they don't know how to think outside the box and they feel like they tried everything, you introduce them to another person that they can resonate with. And then have those two people go through the same process, like the process together, and they typically won't end up feeling the same about the process, and getting them to actively interact with each other. What this sounds like is group therapy. That's kind of the idea behind group therapy, right? I'm not a trained psychologist, obviously, and this is not to be professional advice. This is more for a friend to a friend thing, or with your friends and family thing, where when it becomes dire, that's what group therapy sounds like, right? If the one-on-one is not sufficient and that person can't seem to take in new ideas, you try to invite them to a group therapy where there's an exchange of ideas among multiple people that coincidentally have similar experiences, but they didn't experience it together. And then the other idea is to get a support system of people who literally spent the same experience with them. Gym, teenager group therapy, noted. Yes, absolutely. Um, it you one thing, if you manage to get someone, like, you clearly see this person need a change of pace and they're not working out yet, right? They're not like going to the gym. I would love to challenge you to get them to go to the gym and have it think it's at least fun in some way or enjoyable in some way. Then you've really have the sky's the limit on how much you might have changed that person's work life balance, right? That's kind of what I like about content creation. That is my romantic, it's the romantic summary of why I think YouTube offers like the explosion of content creation, for better or for worse, right? It came with its own situation, but that's what content creators do originally. And now we see the what happens when it's in excess. So naturally, I think humans will, as a whole, will adapt to that too. While content creators is that, to get the foot through the door, it doesn't follow up on it. It's not sustainable. So now we're seeing, what is the internet? How's the internet going to change to do that, to make it sustainable? And when people talk about the thing you said, gym equals teenager group therapy, noted. That to me, what I just described here is what I think many people are saying more explicitly. So when people say, "Oh, you're depressed," or "You're sad," or "You feel like you just need a breath of, a breath in your life," just go work out. It'll make you feel better. Like, usually it will relieve stress. Oftentimes there's no explainer to how. It's often made sound easier because generally, if you can get someone to say something simple and very quickly and it just works consistently, then it's very efficient. If you meet someone who's incredibly intellectually inclined or incredibly self-aware that they're like, they need to lose weight but they can't get themselves to weight, a greater explainer is very useful. And that's kind of my 2 cents on that. Like, if you illustrate that it can empower you or empower other people, or you can find other ways of why going to exercise when you haven't exercised, giving a bigger picture might be useful. A lot of times, exercise isn't the only thing, but it's easily accessible, right? You can just walk out and go for a walk. A lot of it is low cost, right? Very self-controlled. There are very few things that prevent you from doing these things. And that's an easy, accessible way of changing the environment. When you change an environment, you're getting the person to stop hyper-focusing on everything they have at the current moment. It's not necessarily a distraction. It's a potential to find a new skill or new thing that can balance out what they're focusing on now. So usually when people say, "Hey, you should just go out and punch something, it can relieve stress," the activity itself isn't necessarily stressless. It's the act of deviating that person from their current mindset. So the really big underlying idea here is that you're getting the person to do something else. And that's kind of what I hear, but most people would think it's something to do with the exercise. Like, it's something to do with doing the activity. It doesn't have to be fitness though. It can be video games, card games, hanging out with friends. Yeah, no worries. Now I'm gonna try to finish the rest of this. Thanks for the questions again. And thanks for sharing, by the way. Another, it's a wrap. Good thing. I think I'm doing this daily, and it's fantastic. So take your break, enjoy, and I'll try to finish this. Oh yeah, and Merry Christmas if it's still Christmas over there, I suppose. Yeah, happy holidays again.